Bikers humiliate farmer's daughter, unaware he is the most dangerous secret agent. The golden glow of the late afternoon sun bathed the Thornton family farm, stretching its warm light over the sprawling fields of corn and wheat. Jack Thornton stood by the wooden fence, a quiet figure in a wide-brimmed hat and mud-splattered boots. His callous hands gripped a shovel as he surveyed the land. To the untrained eye, Jack was nothing more than a simple farmer, a man whose life revolved around tending crops and repairing machinery. To the people of Cedar Hollow, he was known as a widowed father, raising his spirited 19-year-old daughter, Emily, with quiet dignity. Emily was everything Jack lived for. With her auburn hair pulled back into a braid and a smile that could light up the gloomiest day, she brought life to the farm. She was sharp, quick to laugh, and fiercely independent, always talking about her plans to leave Cedar Hollow to pursue her dream of becoming a veterinarian. While Jack supported her ambitions, the thought of her leaving filled him with a mix of pride and apprehension. Cedar Hollow had always been their home, and it was hard to imagine the farm without her laughter echoing across the fields. "Dad, I'm heading to the fair," Emily called out from the porch, adjusting the strap of her canvas bag. "I'll be back before dark, I promise." Jack turned, his brow furrowing slightly. "All right," he said, his voice gruff but laced with affection. "Just stay out of trouble, okay?" Emily grinned. "Trouble? In Cedar Hollow? Come on, Dad, it's a fair, not a crime scene." Jack chuckled, shaking his head as he watched her hop onto her bike and pedal down the dusty road that led into town. Yet, as her figure disappeared into the horizon, a strange unease settled over him. It wasn't like Jack to worry unnecessarily, but something about today felt different. He shook the thought away, convincing himself it was nothing more than a father's overprotective instincts. The Cedar Hollow County Fair was a burst of color and sound. Children raced from one booth to the next, the smell of popcorn and fried dough lingered in the air, and the cheerful tunes of the carousel filled the background. Emily wandered through the crowd, her eyes lighting up as she passed rows of carnival games and food stalls. For a moment, she let herself forget about the responsibilities waiting for her back at the farm. But not far away, a different group watched her with growing interest. They stood by their motorcycles, dressed in worn leather jackets adorned with patches and symbols that marked them as members of the Iron Reapers, a gang that had recently made Cedar Hollow their new playground. Their leader, Vince, towered over the others. His smug grin and piercing eyes gave him a presence that demanded attention. "Fresh face," Vince muttered to his crew, nodding toward Emily. "She doesn't look like she belongs here." The gang chuckled, their voices low and predatory. Vince adjusted his jacket and started toward Emily, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. Emily was caught off guard when she turned a corner and nearly ran into him. Vince stopped directly in her path, his grin widening as he looked her up and down. "Hey there, sweetheart," he drawled, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "You lost?" Emily stepped back, her instincts immediately telling her this wasn't someone she wanted to talk to. "No," she said firmly, trying to step around him. "I'm fine." But Vince moved to block her way again. His gang surrounded her in a loose circle, their laughter sending a chill down her spine. "No need to rush off," Vince said, his tone shifting from friendly to menacing. "We're just trying to be friendly." Emily's pulse quickened, but she stood her ground. "I'm not interested." "Let me go," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. The gang's laughter grew louder. Vince's grin faded, replaced by a cold sneer. "You've got some fire in you, huh?" he said, stepping closer. "I like that." He reached out to grab her wrist, but Emily reacted instinctively, yanking her arm away and shoving him backward. "I said, leave me alone!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the fair's noise. Heads turned. Fairgoers began to notice the confrontation. Vince scowled, realizing they had drawn too much attention. With a glare, he raised his hands in mock surrender. All right, he said, motioning for his crew to follow him. "This isn't over, sweetheart. Count on it." Emily stood frozen for a moment as the gang swaggered away, her heart pounding in her chest. Taking a deep breath, she brushed herself off and hurried to the fair's exit. The excitement of the day had been replaced by an unsettling fear she couldn't shake. By the time Emily reached the farm, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. She parked her bike by the porch and walked inside, her usual energy dampened by the encounter at the fair. Jack was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and reading a worn copy of the local newspaper. He looked up as she entered, immediately noticing the tension in her shoulders. "How was the fair?" he asked, setting the paper aside. Emily hesitated, forcing a small smile. "It was fine," she said, her voice lacking its usual enthusiasm. "Just busy." Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. He'd spent years learning how to read people, and Emily was no exception. "Something happen?" he asked, his tone calm but probing. "It's nothing," she replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. "Just some idiots trying to act tough. I handled it." Jack leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Idiots?" he repeated. "Who?" "Some bikers," Emily admitted reluctantly. "They were just being jerks, but I told them to back off." "It's fine." Jack's expression darkened, a quiet storm brewing behind his eyes. "Did they touch you?" he asked, his voice a notch lower. "No, Dad," Emily said, sensing his rising anger. "I'm okay." "Really?" Jack nodded, but his mind was already racing. He'd heard about the Iron Reapers, their growing presence in Cedar Hollow, their penchant for picking on anyone who crossed their path. A slow anger simmered beneath his calm exterior, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand on Emily's. "If anything like that happens again, you tell me. Understand?" Emily nodded, grateful for his concern. "I can handle myself," she said softly. Jack gave her a small smile, but as the evening wore on and Emily went to bed, his unease grew. Sitting by the window, he stared out at the moonlit fields, his mind replaying her words. He had left his old life behind years ago, trading danger for peace. But tonight, he felt the old instincts stirring, the ones that told him trouble was coming, and he needed to be ready. The next morning dawned bright and crisp, but there was a weight in the air that Jack couldn't ignore. As he walked out to check on the barn, his sharp eyes caught something unusual. The latch on the main gate was broken, swinging loosely in the breeze. He moved closer, examining the scene with practiced precision. The wood had been smashed, not by an accident or weather, it was deliberate. Tire tracks, fresh and deep, cut across the dirt near his fields. Jack's jaw tightened as he ran a hand over the broken latch. "Emily," he called out, keeping his voice steady. Moments later, she appeared from the house, her braid bouncing against her shoulder. "What's wrong?" "Looks like someone's been on the property," he said simply, pointing to the tracks. "Probably those bikers." Emily's face paled. "You think it's them?" Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I do. They're testing us." Emily frowned, anger replacing her fear. "We should call the sheriff." Jack turned to her, his expression unreadable. "And say what? That we think some bikers left a few tracks? They won't do anything until there's more proof." "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "We stay alert," Jack said, his tone firm. "And we don't let them scare us." Emily hesitated, then nodded. She trusted her father, but the unease in her chest lingered. The Iron Reapers didn't seem like the kind of people who stopped at leaving tracks. The following days passed uneventfully, at least on the surface. Jack worked the fields as usual, keeping a close eye on the edges of his property. Emily tried to go about her routine, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She found herself looking over her shoulder more often, her nerves fraying with every creak of the floorboards or rustle in the trees. Then, one night, the peace shattered. Emily woke to the sound of shattering glass. Her heart leaped into her throat as she sat up, her ears straining in the silence that followed. A moment later, she heard her father's footsteps rushing past her door. She grabbed her phone and followed him downstairs, her stomach sinking when she saw the scene. The front window was broken, shards of glass littering the wooden floor. A rock lay amidst the wreckage, its surface scrawled with crude words, "Stay quiet." Jack stood by the window, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. His breathing was calm, but Emily could see the fury simmering just beneath the surface. "They're trying to scare us," Emily said, her voice trembling. Jack turned to her, his expression softening. "And it's working. That's what they want. We have to do something," she insisted. "We can't just let this happen." Jack nodded slowly. "We won't. Go back to bed. I'll take care of this." Emily opened her mouth to argue but stopped when she saw the steel in his eyes. Reluctantly, she retreated upstairs, her mind racing with fear and anger. Once she was gone, Jack stepped outside, his movements quiet and deliberate. He scanned the property, his sharp eyes catching the faint glow of headlights in the distance. They were there, watching, waiting for a reaction. Jack didn't move toward them. Instead, he stood silently in the dark, his presence alone enough to convey a warning. He was watching too. The next morning, Jack drove into town under the guise of running errands. His real destination, however, was the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Cedar Hollow, the rumored hideout of the Iron Reapers. He parked his truck far enough away to remain unnoticed and approached on foot, his steps silent and calculated. The warehouse was a hulking structure, its rusted walls covered in graffiti. The roar of motorcycles echoed from within, mingled with raucous laughter. Jack circled the building, noting entrances, exits, and the positioning of their bikes. He spotted a broken window near the back and crouched beneath it, listening carefully. Inside, the gang was deep in conversation. Vince's voice stood out, loud and authoritative. "We've got him rattled. Old man's just sitting out there, waiting for us to make the next move." "What's the plan?" another voice asked. Vince chuckled darkly. "We hit him where it hurts. His crops, his animals, whatever makes him tick. We push until he breaks." Jack's fists clenched as he processed their words. They weren't just trying to intimidate him, they wanted to destroy everything he'd worked for. His mind raced as he slipped away from the warehouse, careful not to leave any trace of his presence. That evening, Jack sat at the kitchen table, staring at a small, weathered box he hadn't opened in years. Inside lay the tools of the life he had left behind, a tactical knife, a compact handgun, and a set of lockpicks. He hesitated for a moment before reaching inside, his fingers brushing against the cold steel. He had spent years burying this part of himself, choosing a life of quiet peace over the chaos of his past. But now, that past was calling him back. The Iron Reapers had crossed the line, and Jack knew there was no turning back. Emily walked into the room. Jack closed it gently, his expression unreadable. "Nothing you need to worry about, Dad," she said firmly. "I want to help." Jack looked at her, his eyes softening. "You've already done enough, Emily. I need you to trust me on this." Reluctantly, Emily nodded. She could see the resolve in her father's face, the determination that told her he wasn't going to back down. As she went to bed that night, Jack stepped outside, the box tucked under his arm. He moved through the fields with purpose, his mind already formulating a plan. The Iron Reapers wanted a fight, and Jack was ready to give them one. The Iron Reapers didn't waste any time escalating their harassment. 2 days after the broken window, Emily found the corral gate to the livestock pen wide open. Several animals had wandered into the fields, their paths marked by trampled crops. Jack arrived just in time to prevent the herd from straying farther, his steady hands and calm commands bringing order to the chaos. As he closed the gate and secured it with a stronger latch, Jack glanced toward the horizon. Far off, on the ridge overlooking the farm, he spotted them. 3 bikers sat on their motorcycles, watching, their laughter carried faintly on the wind. Vince was unmistakable, his arrogant posture and loud voice standing out even at this distance. Later that night, Jack retrieved the box he'd opened the evening before. Its contents were spread out on the kitchen table: a compact handgun, a tactical flashlight, a pair of night vision goggles, and a set of tools meant for surveillance. Emily, unable to sleep, came downstairs and froze when she saw the items. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice tinged with alarm. Jack looked up, his expression calm but serious. "It's time to stop playing nice." Emily stared at him, her mind racing. "You've been hiding something. What aren't you telling me, Dad?" Jack sighed, sitting back in his chair. "Emily, there's a lot about my past that I haven't shared. Not because I wanted to lie to you, but because I thought I'd left it all behind." "What are you talking about?" she pressed, her voice trembling. "What past?" Jack met her gaze, the weight of years showing in his eyes. "Before the farm, before this life. I wasn't just some ordinary guy. I worked in counterintelligence. Covert missions. Things I can't talk about, even now." Emily's jaw dropped. You were a spy?" "Not exactly," Jack said. "But close enough." She sank into a chair, struggling to process the revelation. "And now these bikers. They've pushed too far," Jack said firmly. "I've tried to keep things peaceful, but they're not going to stop. And I can't let them put you in danger." Emily looked at the weapons on the table, then back at her father. "What are you planning to do?" Jack gave her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry. I'm not going to hurt anyone unless I have to. But I am going to make sure they understand they picked the wrong fight." The Iron Reapers thought they were untouchable. They didn't know they were being watched. Using the surveillance tools from his box, Jack spent the next 2 nights gathering intelligence on the gang. He moved through the shadows like a ghost, planting small cameras and audio recorders around their clubhouse, a rundown warehouse on the edge of town. He mapped out their routines, noted their vulnerabilities, and identified who held the most sway within the group. Vince, as expected, was their ringleader, but Jack quickly learned that not all the members were as loyal as they appeared. Cracks in their camaraderie became apparent during overheard conversations. Some of the bikers grumbled about Vince's impulsive leadership, while others seemed less enthusiastic about targeting Jack and Emily. Jack filed this information away, knowing it could prove useful. On the 3rd night, Jack made his first move. He waited until the bikers had gathered inside the warehouse for their usual drinking and bragging session. Then, under the cover of darkness, he approached their motorcycles. Using a simple tool from his box, he disabled several bikes. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to ensure they wouldn't start when the gang tried to leave. He didn't stop there. He left behind a warning, a spray-painted message on the warehouse door that read, "Stay off my land." The next morning, the Iron Reapers discovered the sabotage. Vince's furious roar echoed across the property as he stared at the message on the door. His crew scrambled to inspect their bikes, finding cut ignition wires and tampered fuel lines. "Who did this?" Vince bellowed, his face red with anger. One of his lieutenants, a wiry man named Rick, approached cautiously. "Probably the farmer," he muttered. "He's sending a message." Vince clenched his fists. "Oh, he wants a fight? Fine. We'll give him one." Rick hesitated. "You sure about that? The guy's not as soft as we thought. Maybe we should back off." Vince rounded on him, his eyes blazing. "You scared of some old man with a tractor? We're the Iron Reapers. No one humiliates us." Despite Vince's bravado, a sense of unease crept through the group. Jack's actions had rattled them more than they cared to admit. Still, they couldn't let the challenge go unanswered. They began planning their next move, determined to strike back. What they didn't realize was that Jack had already anticipated their retaliation. He wasn't waiting for them to make the next move, he was already 3 steps ahead. Jack returned home that evening, his expression calm but focused. Emily met him at the door, worry etched across her face. "What did you do?" she asked. "Just sent them a little reminder," he replied. "Something to let them know they're not as untouchable as they think." "Dad, this is getting dangerous," Emily said. "What if they come after us again?" "They will," Jack admitted. "But this time, we'll be ready." As the sun set over the farm, Jack stood by the porch, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew the Iron Reapers wouldn't back down easily. But he also knew they'd underestimated him, and that would be their undoing. The Iron Reapers didn't take long to retaliate. 2 nights after Jack's warning, the roar of motorcycles broke the stillness of the countryside. Emily, startled from her sleep, hurried downstairs to find Jack already dressed, his eyes steely as he looked out the window. The faint glow of headlights danced across the fields, growing brighter as they approached the farmhouse. "They're here," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Jack turned to her, his tone calm but firm. "Go upstairs and stay out of sight. Lock your door. Don't come out until I say it's safe." "Dad," Emily started, but the look in his eyes stopped her. She nodded reluctantly and retreated up the stairs. Jack grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, leaving the front door slightly ajar. He moved onto the porch, his silhouette illuminated by the floodlights he had installed the previous day. The bikers were lined up at the edge of the property, their engines rumbling like a pack of wolves ready to pounce. Vince sat at the head of the group, his smirk barely visible under the glow of his headlight. "Evening, old man," Vince called, cutting the engine of his bike. "Heard you've been busy." Jack remained silent, his expression unreadable. Vince chuckled, dismounting and gesturing for his crew to follow. "You think you can mess with us and get away with it? You've got guts. I'll give you that. You've been warned," Jack said, his voice steady. "Leave now, and this ends here." Vince's smirk vanished. "You really think you can scare us? We're not going anywhere." Jack took a step forward, his flashlight sweeping across the group. "I wasn't trying to scare you. I was giving you a chance to walk away. But you made your choice." Before Vince could respond, a loud crack split the air. One of the bikers' headlights shattered, plunging part of the group into darkness. Confusion erupted as they looked around, trying to locate the source of the shot. Vince growled, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell was that?" From his position on the porch, Jack lowered the rifle he had hidden behind the door, his movements calm and deliberate. "Your second warning," he said, his tone cold. "You won't get a third." The tension escalated as the bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Vince, unwilling to back down, stepped closer. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just an old man on a farm." Jack's eyes darkened. "I'm more than that." As the confrontation unfolded, Jack's preparations began to pay off. Unbeknownst to the bikers, he had rigged key points around the farm with simple but effective deterrents. When one of the bikers attempted to flank the barn, he triggered a tripwire that set off a blinding flashbang, disorienting him and sending him stumbling back toward the group. "Vince, we've got traps out here!" the biker yelled, clutching his head. Vince's frustration boiled over. "I don't care! Burn the place down if you have to!" But as the bikers fumbled in the dark, Jack's tactical precision became clear. He moved through the shadows like a phantom, using his knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver the group. With each move, he targeted their confidence, breaking their cohesion. Emily, watching from her upstairs window, felt a mix of fear and awe. She had always known her father as a steady, dependable man, but tonight she saw a side of him she'd never imagined, a man who moved with the precision of someone trained for situations far more dangerous than this. The bikers, now visibly shaken, began retreating toward their bikes. Vince, however, refused to give up. "This isn't over, Thornton!" he shouted, his voice desperate. "We'll be back, and when we come, we'll make sure you regret this." Jack emerged from the shadows, his figure backlit by the floodlights. "You'll regret it first," he said calmly. "You think you can terrorize people and walk away unscathed? You've underestimated me, and that's your biggest mistake." Vince glared at him, but the fear in his eyes betrayed his bravado. With a growl, he turned and mounted his bike, motioning for the others to follow. One by one, the bikers roared away, their tail lights disappearing into the darkness. As the last engine faded into the distance, Jack lowered his rifle and exhaled deeply. The adrenaline coursing through his veins began to ebb, replaced by a calm resolve. He turned toward the house and saw Emily standing on the porch, her face pale but her eyes steady. "They're gone," Jack said quietly. "For now," Emily replied. But I saw the look in their eyes. They'll come back. Jack nodded. And we'll be ready. Emily stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. I know you're doing this to protect me, but I want to help. Teach me how to fight back. Jack paused, surprised by her determination. He placed a hand on her shoulder. I'll teach you how to stay safe. That's what matters most. Emily didn't press further, but as Jack looked at her, he saw the same fire that had carried him through countless battles in his former life. Together, they stepped back inside the house, knowing the fight wasn't over, but confident they wouldn't face it unprepared. The Iron Reapers had licked their wounds but were far from defeated. Vince, furious and humiliated, convened his crew at their warehouse hideout. The men gathered around, their faces a mixture of anger and uncertainty. Vince paced in front of them, his voice a low growl as he addressed the group. That old man thinks he can make fools of us, he said, slamming his fist onto a nearby table. He's got some tricks, sure, but he's just one guy. We've dealt with worse. Vince, I'm not so sure about this. Rick, one of the more cautious bikers, said hesitantly. That guy isn't normal. He's got training, serious training. You saw how he outmaneuvered us. Vince rounded on him, his eyes blazing. Are you scared of some farmer, Rick? Because if you are, maybe you don't belong here. Rick clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists, but he said nothing. Vince smirked, satisfied that his authority was intact. He turned back to the group. We're hitting him where it hurts, Vince declared. His farm, his animals, everything he cares about. We'll leave nothing standing. The bikers nodded reluctantly, though unease hung in the air. The plan was set, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, they mounted their bikes and roared toward Jack's property, their engines echoing through the quiet countryside like a thunderstorm rolling in. Jack sat in the dimly lit living room, the glow of a small monitor illuminating his face. The cameras he had planted around the property fed him real-time footage of the surrounding area. His makeshift surveillance system showed nothing yet, but he knew better than to assume the Reapers would back down. Emily entered the room quietly, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She set one down beside her father and sat across from him, her eyes scanning the monitor. They'll come tonight, she said softly. Jack nodded. They will. She stared at him, searching his face for any trace of the man she thought she knew. He was still her father, but there was an edge to him now, a sharpness she hadn't noticed before. I want to help, she said firmly. You already are, Jack replied. By staying safe. That's all I need from you. Emily frowned but didn't argue. She knew he was right, but the feeling of helplessness gnawed at her. The monitor flickered, and movement appeared on one of the screens. Jack leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the headlights of approaching motorcycles. They're here, he said quietly. Jack moved quickly, extinguishing the lights in the house and motioning for Emily to go upstairs. Stay low and stay quiet, he instructed. She nodded and disappeared up the stairs, leaving Jack to prepare. Outside, the Reapers spread out, their bikes rumbling as they approached the barn and fields. Vince barked orders, his voice carrying over the din. Torch it all! I want this place leveled! One of the bikers lit a Molotov cocktail, preparing to hurl it at the barn. Before he could throw it, a sudden blast of water from a hidden irrigation system struck him full in the face, drenching him and extinguishing the flame. He stumbled back, cursing, as the others looked around in confusion. Jack, watching from a concealed position near the house, smirked. He had rigged the irrigation system to activate at the press of a button, a small but effective deterrent. The Reapers regrouped, but their frustration grew. Vince shouted, "Find him! Drag him out!" As 2 bikers approached the house, Jack sprang into action. From the shadows, he deployed smoke canisters that erupted in thick clouds, obscuring their vision and forcing them to retreat coughing and disoriented. Suddenly, a blaring sound echoed across the property, a deafening siren Jack had installed near the barn. The piercing noise disoriented the bikers further, adding to the chaos. Vince, his patience snapping, charged toward the house. Enough of this! He roared. Show yourself, Thornton! Jack stepped out from the shadows, his rifle slung across his back and a steely expression on his face. Looking for me? Vince froze, momentarily taken aback. He recovered quickly, his smirk returning. You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. It's over, Vince, Jack said, his voice calm but firm. Take your crew and leave, or this ends badly for you. Vince laughed, the sound harsh and humorless. You think you can scare me? You're just one guy. Jack's eyes darkened. One guy's all it takes. Vince lunged, drawing a knife from his belt, but Jack was faster. He sidestepped the attack, grabbing Vince's arm and twisting it behind his back. The knife clattered to the ground as Vince cried out in pain. The remaining bikers hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. Jack's voice cut through the tension. Anyone else want to try? The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado gone. Rick, stepping forward cautiously, addressed Vince. Boss, maybe it's time to walk away. Shut up! Vince snapped, struggling against Jack's grip. Jack leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. Call them off, Vince. Now. Realizing he had no choice, Vince growled. Stand down. The bikers obeyed, mounting their bikes and retreating one by one. Jack released Vince, shoving him toward his crew. This is your last chance, Jack warned. If I see any of you here again, you won't walk away. Vince glared at him, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He climbed onto his bike, muttering curses under his breath, and rode off into the night. As the noise of the motorcycles faded, Emily emerged from the house, her face pale but her eyes steady. Is it over? She asked. For now, Jack replied, his voice weary. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. They won't be back. Emily looked at him, her expression a mixture of relief and awe. You really are something else, Dad. Jack gave her a small smile. I'm just doing what I have to. They stood together in the quiet of the night, the farm still standing despite the chaos. Jack knew the fight had tested everything he'd worked to leave behind, but he also knew he'd do it all again to protect what mattered most. The days following the Reaper's downfall were quiet. The air around the Thornton farm felt lighter, and the tension that had gripped Emily and Jack seemed to dissipate with every sunrise. The bikers were gone, and Vince had vanished, leaving Cedar Hollow to rebuild its peace. Yet, for Jack, the quiet brought reflection, a chance to finally let go of a past that had long haunted him. Jack stood at the edge of his fields, the morning sun warming his back as he leaned against the fence. The crops swayed gently in the breeze, untouched by the chaos that had threatened to destroy them. Emily approached, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to Jack, her expression a mix of relief and curiosity. Looks like the quiet's back, she said, leaning beside him. Jack nodded. For now. Emily took a sip of her coffee, her gaze fixed on the horizon. So, what happens next? Do you think Vince will ever come back? No, Jack said firmly. Not after what happened. People like him don't return to places where they've lost everything. Emily was silent for a moment, then turned to him. You were amazing, Dad. I mean, I always knew you were strong, but seeing you like that, it was like watching a different person. Jack gave her a small smile. It wasn't a different person. It's just a part of me I hoped you'd never have to see. Emily frowned. Why did you never tell me about your past? About everything? Jack set his coffee down, the lines on his face deepening. Because I wanted you to grow up with a life I never had. One without danger, without enemies around every corner. But when they came after you, there was no choice. Protecting you is the only thing that matters. Emily's eyes softened, and she reached out to place a hand on his arm. You did more than protect me. You taught me that strength isn't just about fighting, it's about standing up for what you care about. Jack looked at her, pride swelling in his chest. You're stronger than you think, Emily. And this farm, this life, it's worth fighting for. Later that day, as they worked in the barn repairing the damage left behind by the Reapers, Emily spoke up. You know, I've been thinking. Jack glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. That's always dangerous. She laughed, the sound light and easy. I was thinking about the veterinary program I wanted to join. I still want to go, but maybe not right now. Jack paused, his hammer still in hand. You don't have to stay because of what happened. It's not that, she said quickly. I realized how much this farm means to both of us. I want to help rebuild, to make sure it's stronger than ever. And then, when I do leave, I want to know I've left it in good hands. Jack nodded, a rare glimmer of emotion crossing his face. You've always been good hands, Emily. Whatever you decide, this place will always be here for you. As the weeks turned into months, the farm began to flourish again. The fields, once trampled by intruders, were lush and green. The barn stood tall after careful repairs, and the quiet hum of life returned to Cedar Hollow. Jack's past remained a quiet secret between him and Emily, but the lessons of those harrowing days lingered. He continued to live as he always had, humble, hard-working, and fiercely protective of what mattered most. And Emily, stronger and more determined than ever, embraced her role on the farm with newfound pride. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Emily stood beside Jack on the porch. The cicadas hummed softly in the background, and the warmth of the day lingered in the air. Do you ever miss it? She asked suddenly. Miss what? Jack replied. The life you had before this. The missions, the action. Jack thought for a moment, then shook his head. No. Because everything I could ever want is right here. Emily smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. For the first time in weeks, they both felt at peace. And as the stars emerged, casting their light over the quiet countryside, the Thorntons knew they had not just survived the storm, they had grown stronger because of it.